We have been talking about impacts modeling, socioeconomic, biophysical, biogeochemical impacts. Let's just take a quick look at some of the evidences that exist for impacts. This is a very broad base of observations, which obviously I won't go through, but I mentioned along the way many evidences for shifting species, vegetation, animals, insects, pests. In the ocean, the data is not that great, but still there is evidence of changes in the ocean as well, impacts. Typically, we look at 10 indicators of human fingerprint on climate change. So even if you don't believe in the warming and why it's not steady, why it has ups and downs because of internal variability or natural variability, you can combine multiple evidences that show the consistency of human impact. Okay, obviously we can measure CO2 very reliably, accurately and precisely, and use isotopes to show that the increasing carbon dioxide is actually coming from burning fossil fuels and so on. And once it's put in the air, we can look at the shrinking impact of CO2 all the way into the thermosphere, so there is less heat escaping to space, which causes shrinking of thermosphere, rising of tropopause, less oxygen in the air because of all the fossil fuel burning, cooling of the stratosphere to first order because we are trapping more energy in the troposphere, more fossil fuel carbon in the air, 30 billion tons of CO2 per year that we can already understand. This number is now over 40, I think. If you do it as CO2 equivalent, it'll be different, so we have to be careful. More heat returning to Earth, obviously causing the warming. More fossil fuel carbon can be detected in corals as well. Nights warming faster than days, which is what we expect in terms of the increased greenhouse effect. Okay, corals obviously assimilate carbon, and the fractionation of C12 and C13 depends on the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, when it's increased by fossil fuel burning, leaves a signature of burning old hydrocarbons, which are typically depleted in C13, because when photosynthesis happens, plants prefer to take up C12 because it's energetically more efficient. So the hydrocarbon that's left as fossil fuel is depleted in C13, and when you burn it, you put more C12 into the atmosphere, so you can measure that as well in coral fossil fuel carbon. Okay. The other impact is, of course, CO2 fertilization. I think I've mentioned this before. This is looking at leaf area index from different products based on satellites. This is something called GlobeMap. This is called GIMS, and this is GLASS, the Global Land Assessment System, or some such thing. You can look it up, and this is showing the trend in probability density of the greening. Of course, there are details that the greening over China is related a lot to afforestation or reduced deforestation, whereas over India, large changes are mostly related to agricultural activities. So this is just leaf area index, not necessarily increased carbon dioxide sequestration in biomass or any such thing. But nonetheless, this is clearly an impact of climate change and emissions. This is a nice report on climate change impacts on ecological processes in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems, and they go from genes to biomes to people. So in total, 82% of the 94 ecological processes show evidence of being affected by climate change. So this is attributable change. Within levels of organization, the percentage of processes impacted varies from 60% for genetics to 100% for species distribution. So just the habitat changes and species distribution is almost 100%. So it's looking at organisms, 36 of them processed totally, looking at genetic diversity, activity rates, and body size and shape. So you can see the changes going from the center to increasing percentages. Distribution, 100% change in species distribution. So 9 processes in total were looked at in terms of range, size and location, habitat quantity and quality, in terms of predation rates, food availability, water availability, etc. So there are many metrics used to define habitat quantity and quality. Okay, in terms of community, biomass and primary productivity, composition and species interactions, you can see in productivity there is 100% detection of change, interspecific relationships, and in terms of population you can look at recruitment, which means how many of the seeds or fish eggs translate into adulthood. So that's recruitment. Age structure, abundance, migration, timing of budding. So the global warming ends the winter earlier, so spring arrives earlier in terms of temperature, but the length of the day doesn't change. So there is phenological responses associated with these kind of changes. So timing of budding, flowering and spawning are included in those. So you can see phenological changes, large percentage, and dynamics, vegetation dynamics changes. So these are marine ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. Obviously observing marine ecosystems is much harder than observing freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems. Okay, so these are the climate change consequences for humans. Affected ecological processes have direct consequences in food systems and human health. So it is looking at resource security and human health, which we touched on before, looking at organisms in terms of genetics, physiology and morphology, population in terms of phenology and dynamics, species distribution, and communities that we looked at. So obviously there are various factors here, like decreased crop yields in hot climates and increases in cool climates. So food production is always going to be an issue in terms of creating winners and losers. Global South is going to lose out because they're in warm conditions, so they are going to have not only hot climates. So even when temperature increases, increased precipitation may not help if the wilting point is reached or the optimal temperature of photosynthesis is crossed over. Okay, in terms of phenology and dynamics for population, decreased genetic diversity and altering flowering time in wild cereals and novel crop varieties are already observed. For distribution of human health, expanding and or new distribution of disease vectors. So deer tick disease like Lyme disease, which shouldn't be in high latitudes, is now endemic to high latitudes because of the warming and reduced number of frost days and so on. And in terms of community, for example, in human health, we have increased human-wildlife conflicts, which is seen in terms of COVID, for example. Not directly attributable to this, but obviously with increasing population and reduced habitats for wildlife, you're going to have increased contacts between humans and wildlife and jumping of viruses from, let's say, bats to humans or bats to pangolins to humans and so on. So bats may not be affected, but we are severely affected. There are evidences of accelerating species extinctions documented from 1500 to itself. So mammals and birds, this is cumulative extinction percentage done by the International Union for Conservation Network. They evaluated the species, so it's a percentage. Mammals and birds way up there, vertebrates, fish and other vertebrates, and the general background loss of species. Okay, so there are human activities like deforestation, degradation, which matter, but there are also direct impacts of climate change itself on habitat degradation in terms of habitat quality and quantity. For example, acidification of the ocean is going to impact corals and other calcifying animals. Fishing is going to change the species composition. It's called fishing down the food web. For example, if we keep catching the big fish, the species on which these fish live on are going to grow in population because they don't have the predator anymore, and that cascades down into the food web. So there are human impacts, and then there are human driven climate change impacts, and then there are feedback. So we have to worry about all these things when it comes to evidence of impacts of climate change, but also non-climate factors like human activities.